The wind carried the smell of iron that morning, the kind that spoke of oncoming snow and long hunger. Elias Granger felt it before he saw it. The shift in the air, the hush in the pines, the way the frost clung stubbornly to the earth as if it, too, feared being brushed away. He tugged the worn rope of the sled, the wooden runners groaning against the frozen mud. Behind him, 2 children followed without complaint. Caleb, 12, walked with the stiff determination of a boy trying too young to be a man. Ruth, barely 6, stumbled more often than she stepped, her knuckles white around the ragged shawl wrapped twice around her shoulders. They had been walking since dawn. The road to Alder Creek was narrow and unfriendly, lined with bramble and frost-bitten cattails, a road meant for horses or supply wagons, not for a man and 2 half-starved children dragging a winter's worth of chopped firewood and hopes, thinner than the ice crusting. Ruth's curls. Elias paused to let the children rest. Ruth climbed onto the sled for a moment, shivering despite the wool Elias had draped over her earlier. "How much farther, Papa?" Caleb asked, his breath fogging with the question. 2 miles, Elias answered, though he suspected it was closer to 3. But hope, he'd learned, needed small lies to stay alive. "Is Missa Haven really gonna buy all the wood?" Ruth whispered. "If she said she will, she will." Elias wished he believed it as fully as the child did. Alder Creek was holding its annual winter gathering today, a tradition older than the timber mills, older than the stone chapel that clung to the hillside. A day when families brought smoked meats and winter vegetables, jars of honey, quilts patched with stories. A day of trade and blessing, where no man went home with exactly what he brought. Elias had brought wood. That was all he had left. Since the fire in October, the fire that took their barn, their winter stores, and the last of Martha's quilts, everyday living had become a negotiation with loss. Even now, when he closed his eyes, he still saw the orange glow against the sky, the way the flames had eaten the rafters like starving beasts. Martha had died 2 winters before, taken by a fever that stole her breath overnight. But losing the barn felt like losing her all over again. She had sown their life into that barn, mending harnesses, stacking feed, humming hymns while she worked. Her voice still lingered in its ashes. "Papa." Ruth's voice pulled him back. "Yes, little bird. My toes hurt. Climb up." He lifted her gently, settling her onto the wood bundles where she curled like a small winter sparrow. Caleb took the rope from him without being asked, jaw tight, eyes forward. The boy walked like he carried a family on his shoulders. Maybe he did. When they reached the ridge overlooking Alder Creek, the town looked almost festive despite the harsh wind. Smoke curled cheerfully from chimneys, and the small square had already begun to fill with people. Booths made of timber slats stood in rows, their roofs covered with canvas to ward off drifting snow. And the church bell, old iron, cracked along the side, rang twice, calling neighbors to gather. Ruth perked up. "Papa, look, banners." "Yes." Elias tried to smile. Someone took care to make the place welcoming. He wondered if there would be a place for them inside that welcome. The Grangers had not been to a gathering since Martha's death. Elias had kept to himself, working his plot of land, mending tools, chopping wood to sell. It had been easier to avoid being the object of pitying eyes. But pity didn't fill a cellar. Pity didn't keep a fire burning. Today he needed this gathering more than his pride could protest. As they reached the square, people parted politely, but with that unmistakable look, recognition, filled with quiet sympathy. Elias straightened, forcing his shoulders level. Caleb dropped the sled rope and stood tall beside him. Ruth clung to her father's coat. "Elias Granger," called old Morton from the honey stand. "Thought we'd lost you to that patch of pines you call a farm." "Still breathing," Elias replied. "For now," Morton muttered under his breath, not unkindly. They passed tables laid with jars of preserves, woven baskets, smoked fish, bolts of cloth. The smell of stewing rabbit drifted from a cauldron near the chapel steps. Children ran about with red cheeks, boots thudding against wood planks that had been laid to cover the mud. Caleb's eyes lingered on a group of boys, gathered around a handmade sleigh with brass runners. "You can look," Elias murmured. Caleb shook his head. "We're here to sell." Such a careful child. Too careful for his age, a voice broke through the cold. "Mr. Granger?" Elias turned. A woman stood near the chapel gate, a basket braced on one hip, her hair pinned beneath a wool hood. Nora Haven, the schoolteacher, the widow Haven, some called her, though she seldom spoke of the husband she lost to a fall from a logging wagon. She walked toward them with purpose, boots crunching over thin ice. When she reached Ruth, she knelt without hesitation. "You must be freezing," she said, her voice warm as fresh bread. She pulled a knitted mitten from her basket and slipped it over Ruth's bare hand before Elias could protest. "You don't have to." "I knitted too many," she said briskly. "Accidents of busy hands." Elias said nothing. Gratitude pressed against the pride in his throat until neither could find words. Nora rose, brushing snow from her skirt. "I heard you were bringing winter wood." "Yes, hoping to sell enough to—" He stopped, the sentence collapsing under its own weight. Hoping to survive sounded too bleak for daylight admission. Nora didn't press. Her gaze flicked to the sled. "Good wood, tight grain. I'll take 4 bundles." "4?" Elias blinked. "That's more than— I have a classroom stove to keep warm, and a home too drafty for one person, much less 2. She offered a soft, apologetic smile. "And my brother is returning from the coast. He'll need fuel." Elias nodded, humbled. "Thank you." Ruth tugged Nora's sleeve. "Miss Haven, do you teach reading?" "I do." Nora crouched again. "Would you like to learn?" Ruth nodded shyly. Caleb stepped forward, protective. "We don't have the fee." Nora's expression softened. "Some children pay with coin. Some with help stacking wood, mending benches, clearing paths. Learning's worth more than copper, wouldn't you say?" Caleb swallowed hard, then nodded. Elias felt something warm spread unexpectedly in his chest. Not joy, not hope. Something quieter. Like thawing. But thawing could be dangerous. Ice held cracks better than flesh did. As they moved deeper into the square, Elias felt eyes on him. Not cruel, not pitying, but watching nonetheless. People remembered the fire. People remembered how Martha had been beloved. People wondered how much a man could lose before he disappeared entirely. He spotted Nora again at a distance, speaking to Mrs. Kerrigan at the textile booth. Both women glanced his way, and he looked down quickly, pretending to adjust the rope on the sled. A man approached, broad-shouldered, thick coat, expression sharp. Marshall Reddick. "Granger," he said, tone unreadable. "Need a word." Elias stiffened. "About?" "Your land note." The word struck like cold iron. "Not here," Elias murmured. Reddick shrugged. "As you wish. But the council meets on Monday. They'll be asking if you plan to keep the land through winter." Behind Elias, Caleb froze. Ruth's small hand gripped his coat. "I'll have payment," Elias said. "You'll need more than promises." Before Elias could answer, Nora Haven appeared at his elbow, her voice quiet but firm. "Marshall," she said, "the council agreed no business of debt would be discussed during the gathering." Reddick eyed her coolly. "Just given a reminder." "Consider it delivered," she replied. The marshal snorted, tipped his hat, and walked off. Elias exhaled slowly. "You didn't have to step in," he said. "Yes, I did," Nora answered simply. "This day is for warmth, not worry." Ruth reached for her hand and Nora squeezed it gently. The gathering grew louder as noon light broke thinly across the square. Families lined up for stew. Musicians tuned fiddles. The mill owners set out a barrel of cider that steamed like spiced fog. Elias sold 2 more bundles. Morton bought one for his sister. A young couple bought one for their newborn's room. Each sale felt like a breath his lungs had forgotten how to take. Then came the moment that changed the day. Near the chapel, a group of townsfolk stood laughing. Nothing cruel in the sound, but nothing kind either. "Did you see him dragging that bundle sled?" someone whispered. "Barn still, Ash?" "He shouldn't have brought the little ones," another murmured. "Cold'll bite off their toes." "Man's drowning," a third added. "Just doesn't know it yet." Elias stood frozen. Their words weren't meant for him, but they'd been said loud enough to hear, loud enough to bruise. Caleb's face crumpled. Ruth pressed her cheek into Elias's coat, trying to vanish. Before Elias could move them away, another voice cut through the air, not loud but clear. "That's enough." Nora Haven stepped into the small circle of gossipers. her posture calm, her eyes blazing. "You speak of a man who came here today despite hardship, a man raising 2 children alone, a man who brought what he had, which is more than some of us here." Her gaze swept the group. "Shame comes in many forms," she said softly. "Sometimes it belongs to those who speak, not those who listen." The gossipers flushed, muttered, dispersed. Elias stood rooted, his breath locked inside him. No one had defended him like that since Martha. He didn't know how to accept such shelter. Nora approached, her expression gentler now. "I hope I didn't overstep." "You didn't." His voice was rough. "I just don't want trouble." "Then let me stand in its way once in a while." Her smile was small, wry. "You don't have to carry everything alone." Ruth slipped her hand into Nora's again, as if the matter were already decided. Caleb looked at Elias with a question, one the boy didn't voice but one. Elias felt, "Can we trust her? Can we let anyone close again?" Elias didn't know the answer. Not yet. But the day was shifting, warming, softening like snow beginning to melt. And sometimes, thaw was the first mercy of spring, even in the dead of winter. As the sun dipped low and lanterns were lit along the chapel rail, Nora walked with them to the edge of the square. "Come back after supper," she said. "There'll be singing around the stove. Stories, too. Ruth might like the puppet show." Ruth nodded vigorously. Caleb looked hopeful despite himself. Elias hesitated. Pride and hunger battled in his chest. "We'll come," he said finally. Nora smiled. A smile that felt like a lantern lifted against the long night. And the 3 Grangers walked into the gathering, dusk with something they had not carried in months. A beginning. A small one, but a beginning nonetheless. The night gathered fast in Alder Creek. Winter nights always did, collapsing over the hills like a wool blanket, pulled too roughly over a restless sleeper. By the time Elias returned with the children after a short rest near the fire pit, lanterns glowed in the chapel windows, soft amber squares, against the gathering blue steady as heartbeats. Inside, the winter gathering had taken on a new rhythm. The frantic trading of the morning had eased into small clusters of neighbors, sharing cider, passing bowls of stew, humming old hymns while children darted between legs like winter foxes let loose. Nora Haven stood near the stair rail, placing a new candle onto the wooden holder she'd carved herself. She glanced up when the Grangers entered, her eyes warm as hearthlight. "You came back," she said. "Yes," Elias replied. "Thought it best the children. Have some joy today." "And you?" she asked gently. Elias almost smiled. "I'll borrow a bit if any's left." "Plenty left." Nora set the candle upright. "Joy doesn't run out. People just forget how to pass it around." Ruth tugged her father's coat. "Papa, can I see the puppets?" "Go," Elias said, giving her a small nod. She rushed off to the far corner, where a traveling tinker had set up a small puppet stage made of painted boards. Caleb followed more slowly, stopping to examine the craftsmanship of the wooden frame. Nora watched them go, then looked at Elias. "Would you like some cider? It's warm, and not watered down this year." Elias nodded, and Nora handed him a cup ladled from the steaming barrel. For a moment they simply stood together, leaning against the chapel wall, the sound of voices circling around them like the hum of distant bees. "How long has it been since you've come to a gathering?" Nora asked. 2 years. "Since Martha?" Her voice didn't pry, only understood. "Yes." Nora folded her hands. "She was loved. I remember the day she taught my class basket weaving. Ruth wasn't even walking then. Martha carried her on her hip the entire lesson." Elias swallowed. "She carried us all, it seems." Nora didn't reply, but her silence was kind. Music swelled from the chapel's corner, a fiddle warming to life beneath. Old Harlan's practiced fingers. Children clapped along. Adults stomped boots gently against the plank floor in rhythm. Someone called for a story, and Mrs. Brigham, the midwife, stood up to recount a tale of a lost cow that wandered into the woods only to return with a newborn calf in tow. The room brightened with laughter. Ruth, sitting cross-legged near the puppet stage, giggled with the others. Caleb leaned against a support beam, pretending not to smile, and Elias felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't allowed in months, some fragile thread of belonging. Barely woven, but there. Nora followed his gaze. They're happy tonight. They've not had many nights like this, Elias admitted. They deserve more. She hesitated, then added, and so do you. Before Elias could respond, Marshal Reddick reappeared at the doorway, hat in his hands, eyes scanning the room. Nora stiffened slightly. Elias straightened too, but the marshal didn't approach. Instead, he lifted a hand in greeting and joined a group of men near the stove, avoiding their corner entirely. Nora let out a breath. At least he remembers the rule. No business tonight. He's not wrong, Elias said quietly. I'm behind on the note. Winter doesn't bargain. Neither does hardship, Nora replied. But men do. And not all of them speak as Reddick does. Elias studied her face. She meant every word, her sincerity unmarred by pity. That alone softened something inside him he didn't realize was still clenched. The fiddle finished its tune. The puppet show ended in applause. Children rushed toward the long table where slices of honey, cake were being passed around. Elias stepped forward to follow his children, but Nora caught his sleeve lightly. Elias, she said, sit with me a moment. She moved toward a small bench beneath the window. He hesitated, then joined her. Snow drifted lazily outside, turning the glass to a pale blur. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Nora said softly, everyone carries something into these gatherings. Some carry news, some carry goods, some carry grief, and some, she glanced toward him, carry more than they can manage. Elias looked down at his roughened hands. I didn't mean for my children to carry any of it. They're carrying love, Nora said simply. That's what shows. He exhaled hard, chest tightening. Sometimes, I feel like the world keeps shrinking around us. Every month there's less of something. Less wood, less food, less warmth, less Martha. Nora's voice softened. Loss reduces the world, yes, but kindness builds it back. Slow as winter thaw maybe, but it builds. He shook his head. I don't know how to let people help. Then let them try. She offered a gentle smile. No one survives a frontier winter alone. Ruth barreled into them suddenly, arms wide. Papa, the puppet man let me help hold the fox puppet. He said I have gentle fingers. Nora gasped in playful delight. A fox? Was it a clever fox? Ruth nodded vigorously. He tricked a bear and a crow. Well, Nora said, patting her hair, sounds like a fox who knew exactly what he was doing. Caleb joined next, handing Elias a small carved token shaped like a pine tree. One of the tinkers let me trade a wood scrap for it, he said. Said it'd bring winter luck. Elias turned the charm over in his palm. The carving was simple, but careful, its edges smoothed with pride. You traded well. Caleb's face lit in a way Elias hadn't seen in a long time. The children ran off again, pulled by new excitement, and Elias watched them go until they disappeared into the crowd. They're opening again, Nora murmured beside him. Children fold into themselves after loss, but with warmth they open. Elias rubbed a hand across his jaw. They used to laugh more. They will again. Will they? His voice was raw. Yes. Nora lifted her eyes to his. Because you keep walking. Because you brought them here. Because they still feel safe with you, even when the world feels dangerous. He swallowed, throat thick. Words he didn't know how to say tangled inside him. A loud clatter interrupted the moment. The chapel door swung open, a gust of cold wind swirling snow into the room. A wagoner stumbled in, coat dusted thick with frost. Storm coming? He shouted. Hard one. Blowing in faster than expected. People murmured nervously. Elias stood immediately. How long? An hour, maybe less. Nora closed her eyes briefly. The road home. It'll ice quickly. Elias looked toward his children. Caleb had already heard. He was gathering Ruth's shawl, tugging her gently toward the door. Nora saw the worry flicker across Elias's face. You shouldn't try the ridge road in a storm. I don't have a choice, he replied. If the snow piles in the hollow, we'll be trapped inside the cabin. You could stay in the schoolhouse, Nora said. There's a stove, blankets. I can't impose on you. You aren't. Nora met his gaze steadily. Schoolhouse is for everyone in need. And right now, that means you. Elias hesitated, every instinct screaming that he shouldn't take more than he could repay. But then Ruth sneezed, a tiny thin sound, and his hesitation died. Show us the way, he said quietly. Nora nodded, relief softening her face. Gather your things. I'll take the lanterns. Together, they crossed the chapel floor. Snow now slapped against the windows like thrown handfuls of flour. Children were being bundled in coats, adults calling farewells quickly. Caleb took the sled rope without being told. Ruth held Nora's hand tightly, trusting her completely now. Outside, darkness had thickened. The lantern swung wildly in the wind, scattering trembling circles of gold on the snowy ground. Stay close, Nora called above the rising howl. The schoolhouse is only 2 streets over. The wind clawed at them, tearing at coats, stinging faces. Snowflakes sliced through the air, sharp as grain chaff, swirling in wild eddies that threatened to swallow the path entirely. The sled dragged harder now, the runners catching on, forming drifts. Caleb leaned his whole body weight into the rope. Elias placed a steadying hand on the wood bundles to keep them from toppling. Nora held the lantern high, shielding Ruth with her other arm. The child pressed her face into Nora's coat, her small boots struggling to find purchase in the deepening snow. Halfway down the second street, the storm swallowed the world. Sound muffled, shapes blurred. Only the lantern's struggling glow kept them tethered to each other. Almost there, Nora shouted, but her voice was nearly lost in the gale. A sudden gust ripped the lantern's flame sideways. It flickered, thin, fragile, then died. Darkness crashed over them. True winter darkness, thick and pitiless. Ruth whimpered. Caleb froze. Elias stepped forward instantly, pulling both children to him. It's all right. Stay close. Keep a hand on each other. I'm sorry, Nora whispered, breath shaking. I should have brought 2 lanterns. Not your fault. They pressed forward blind, boots sinking deeper with each step. Snow gathered on eyelashes, filled collars, numbed fingers even through wool. Elias found Nora's arm and squeezed. How far? Half a block, she answered. Maybe less. Another gust hit, brutal, merciless. It staggered them sideways. Caleb nearly fell, Ruth cried out. Elias leaned into the wind, forcing his body forward inch by inch. Papa, Caleb said, voice trembling. I can't see anything. Hold on. Elias tightened his grip. Don't let go of the rope, whatever happens. The storm roared like some ancient beast awakened, its breath curling into their bones. Ruth sobbed. Papa, I'm scared. I'm here, he whispered fiercely. I'm here. We'll get through. Then, through the chaos, came a glimmer. A faint, flickering rectangle of gold. Nora gasped. The schoolhouse window. The glow was weak, blurred by snow, but unmistakable. A candle burned inside. One. She must have left earlier without thinking. It would guide them home. Head for the light, Elias said. They trudged toward it, each step heavier than the last, until their boots hit wood. The bottom step of the schoolhouse porch. Nora lunged forward, found the door, threw it open. Warmth washed over them like blessing. Inside, the stove still glowed with banked coals. Blankets were stacked neatly along the wall. A pot of leftover broth simmered from the midday meal. Ruth collapsed into Elias's arms, shaking. Caleb stumbled in behind her, pushing the sled through the doorway with the last of his strength. Nora barred the door against the storm. For a long moment no one spoke. The wind howled outside, clawing at the walls. But inside there was firelight, and warmth, and breath slowly returning to lungs. Elias knelt to hold both children, their cold cheeks pressed to his neck, their limbs trembling. You're safe, he whispered. You're safe now. Nora crouched beside them. You're welcome to stay till morning. The storm won't break before then. Thank you, Elias said, voice scraped raw. For everything. Nora met his eyes. What he saw there was not charity, not obligation. It was something steadier, something that felt like the first brick of a rebuilt world. Outside, snow pounded the roof like 1,000 fists. Inside, warmth gathered in slow circles. Firelight, breath, shared quiet. Nora brought blankets, draping them around Ruth's shoulders. Caleb accepted his with stiff pride. But when the warmth seeped in, he relaxed at last. Elias settled near the stove. The children curled against him like 2 small birds that had found their roost. Nora sat across from him, hands wrapped around a cup of broth. For a while, the only sound was the storm. Then she said softly, You did well tonight. I nearly lost us. You kept them alive. She held his gaze. Not many men could have. Elias lowered his head, overcome. Nora added gently, "And tomorrow, we'll sort the rest." "We?" "Yes, Elias, we." The storm raged on, but for the first time in many winters, Elias Granger felt something warm enough to rise above the cold. A possibility. A partner in the dark. A home he hadn't expected. And the long night stretched ahead. Dangerous. Loud. Merciless. But inside the schoolhouse, a small family, and a woman learning how to join them. Weathered it together. Not alone. Not anymore. The schoolhouse settled into the storm like an old ship riding out a dark sea. Its timbers creaked. Its windows rattled, but it held fast. The wind screamed across the roof. Snow hissed against the panes. And every now and then a low, distant groan rolled through the valley, as if the mountains themselves were shifting under the storm's weight. Inside, the stove pulsed with steady heat, its glow stretching long shadows across the room. Elias sat near it, legs stretched toward the fire. Ruth curled against his chest beneath 3 layers of blankets. Caleb lay on the bench beside him, pretending to rest but watching everything with that protective alertness he'd inherited too young. Nora moved quietly about the room, adding wood to the stove, checking window latches, shaking snow from her coat. The dim firelight softened her features, turning the sharp lines of cold into gentler curves. "Wind's easing a little," she murmured, listening. Elias tilted his head. "Not by much. Enough to breathe," she said with a small smile. "I'll take it." She brought him a fresh blanket. Thick wool, far nicer than anything he owned. He didn't reach for it. "Nora, you've given us enough." She set the blanket over his shoulders anyway. "It's winter, Elias. Not charity. Everyone shares what they have." Ruth stirred at the sound of her voice and blinked up at Nora, eyes red-rimmed but soft with trust. "Miss Haven," she whispered, "can you sing the song from school? The one about the snow geese?" Nora knelt beside her. "Of course, little one." Her voice rose gently, low at first, almost humming, then settling into a melody older than Alder Creek itself. A song of migrating birds, long roads, and returning spring. Ruth's eyes fluttered shut. Caleb's shoulders eased. Even Elias found the tightness in his chest loosening, breath settling into an easier rhythm. The schoolhouse felt warmer after the song, as if music had stitched cracks the storm had widened. When Ruth slept again, Nora stood and went to fetch the kettle. Elias watched her hands move with quiet precision. The way she handled the lid, the way her hair loosened from its pins as she bent to ladle water. "You take care of everyone," he said. She paused. "It helps distract the heart." "From what?" She didn't answer. Not at first. The kettle began to steam. She poured hot water into 2 tin cups and handed one to him. Then she sat on the bench across from him, the cup warming her hands. "From being alone," she finally said. "I've grown used to quiet rooms. Too used to them." The wind moaned across the windows. Elias studied her face. "How long were you married?" 4 years. Her gaze drifted to the stove. "My husband Daniel was a wagon foreman. He loved the road more than he loved the hearth. He didn't do it to hurt me. It was just who he was. Always moving, always chasing something farther on." She exhaled, the breath shaky. "The day he fell from the wagon, I wasn't surprised he died on the road. I was only surprised the road didn't take him sooner. That must have been hard." "It was lonely," she said simply, and then it was silent. Elias understood that too well. He leaned back, letting the heat soak into his spine. "Martha was different. She rooted herself wherever we settled. She built our home with her hands. Every shelf, every quilt, every cradle. She never belonged to the road." "She belonged to us." Nora nodded. "Sometimes I wish I'd had that. A partner who wanted to stay." "You seem strong alone." "I've learned to be," she said. "But strength isn't the same as wanting." Elias looked down at Ruth's sleeping form. Her tiny fingers curled in his coat. "I used to think I could manage alone, for their sake, but it's a smaller life, a harder one. It doesn't have to stay that way." Her words were soft but carried weight. Weight that settled between them like a shared blanket neither dared claim. The storm surged suddenly, slamming against the walls. The stove flickered. Ruth whimpered. Caleb jolted upright. "It's all right." Elias murmured, stroking Ruth's hair. Just wind. But even he felt the tremor of doubt. The schoolhouse might have been sturdy, but the storm was ferocious. Nora strode to the windows, checking for cracks. If the drift pile's too high, the door may freeze shut, she warned. We'll need to keep the stove going till morning. I'll tend the fire, Elias said. Caleb stood up, shivering as he approached. I can help. You can rest, Elias replied. It's been a long day. Caleb opened his mouth to protest, but Nora touched his shoulder. You kept your sister safe through the storm. That's more than enough for one night. Caleb swallowed, pride and exhaustion battling inside him. Then he nodded and returned to his bench. Nora helped Elias carry 2 more logs to the stove. Their fingers brushed as they worked. Not intentionally, not avoiding, just naturally. The contact was brief, but something warm stirred through Elias's hand that had nothing to do with fire. When the stove glowed hot again, Nora stepped back, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. You should rest too, she said. Elias shook his head. I don't sleep easy. Few people do, she replied. When they've lost someone. He looked at her. Really looked. You speak from experience. I do. He wanted to say something. Something honest. Something vulnerable, but words tangled in his throat. Nora didn't push. She simply sat down beside him on the floor, sharing the warmth of the stove, close enough that their shoulders brushed lightly. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was something shared, something building. The storm raged on. Inside, the world narrowed to the glow of the stove, the steady breathing of sleeping children, and the presence of a woman who felt more like calm than anything he'd known in months. After a long, quiet stretch, Nora spoke again, her voice nearly a whisper. Elias, what will you do when spring comes? Rebuild, he answered. And until then? He hesitated. Survive, one day at a time. That's not a plan, she said gently. That's a prayer. Maybe both. Nora sighed, leaning back against the wall. The council shouldn't be breathing down your neck like this. Winter debts aren't meant to be collected until thaw. Marshal Reddick doesn't care about timing. He should, she said sharply. Your place means something to this town. To your children. To you. Elias rubbed his forehead. It meant something when Martha was alive. She made it a home. I'm just keeping it from falling apart. But you showed up today, Nora said. At the gathering, that matters. You brought what you had, and you let others meet you where you are. That alone. She smiled faintly. That is rebuilding. A lump rose in his throat. Why do you care so much? He asked quietly. Nora blinked, surprised. But she didn't look away. Because someone should, she said. Because I see what you're trying to do. Because your children deserve a life bigger than struggle. And because… She stopped, breath catching. Elias waited. Because, she continued softly, it feels good to care again. Those words stirred something deep inside Elias's chest. Something warm, something painful, something hopeful. Before he could respond, Ruth squeaked in her sleep, rolling over. Nora reached out instinctively, tucking the blanket around the little girl with such tenderness that Elias felt the breath leave his lungs. She would have been a good mother. Or maybe she already was, in all the ways that mattered. I should check the door, Nora whispered, standing. Elias rose with her. Together they padded to the heavy wooden door at the front of the schoolhouse. Snow pressed against the bottom, packed tight. Wind forced cold air through the cracks. But the door held firm when Elias tested the latch. Frozen already, he murmured. We'll manage, Nora said. The building's strong. She turned back toward the room, but Elias remained for a moment, looking through the narrow window pane into the whirling darkness outside. Storms had a way of exposing the fragile parts of a man. His fears, his regrets, his loneliness, but storms also revealed who stood beside him. When he returned to the stove, Nora had taken a seat on the floor again, drawing her shawl closer. She looked tired now, the day's efforts wearing through her strength. Get some rest, Elias said gently. I will, but someone needs to stay awake for the fire. I'll do it. You've done enough. You shouldn't watch it alone, she murmured. If you doze off… I won't, he said. Nora hesitated, then lay on the floor near the stove, not far from Ruth, not far from him. She faced the fire, her breath evening out slowly. Elias sat beside her, stoking the logs, listening to the crackle of flame. Minutes stretched into an hour. The storm outside beat relentlessly at the walls, but inside, warmth held. At one point Nora shifted in her sleep, her fingers brushing against Elias's coat. He didn't move. He didn't dare. Something about that small contact rooted him more deeply than any storm ever could. He watched the fire burn, watched the woman beside him breathe, watched his children sleep in safety they hadn't known in too long, and he felt, for the first time in many winters, that he wasn't holding the world together alone. Near dawn, the storm quieted, its fury draining into a soft, tired wind. Snow still fell, but gently now, flakes drifting like feathers settling after a long fight. Nora stirred, blinking awake. "Morning?" she whispered. "Nearly," Elias said. She pushed herself up, wincing as her back cracked. "I must have fallen asleep on the floor." "You needed it." "You did too," she replied. Elias gave a small shrug. "I'll sleep when the sun rises." Nora smiled, rubbing warmth into her hands. "Elias, thank you for keeping watch." "You kept us alive," he said simply. Outside, dim blue light spread slowly, revealing a world buried under feet of snow. The schoolhouse door was covered nearly halfway up the frame. "We're trapped for now," Nora said. "We'll dig out when the wind settles. It may take hours. I've got nowhere else to be." She looked at him, really looked, and something unspoken passed between them. Something warm, something brave. Ruth yawned loudly. Caleb stretched like a cat. The children blinked awake to the faint promise of morning. "Papa," Ruth whispered, "did the storm eat the world?" "No, little bird," Elias said softly. "Just buried it. We'll dig it back." Nora stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "Together," she added, and Elias didn't flinch at the word. Not this time. Morning arrived slowly, as if reluctant to pull back the veil of storm that had buried Alder Creek. The sky glowed faintly, behind thick clouds, pale as milk. The storm had left the world in deep silence, a silence so complete, Elias could hear the soft tick of melting frost against the schoolhouse window. Ruth sat wrapped in blankets near the stove, swinging her small feet, chewing on a piece of leftover bread Nora had warmed. Caleb stood at the window, staring at the snowstack crawling halfway up the pane. "Papa," he murmured, "we're really buried." "Yes," Elias said, pulling on his boots, "but not forever." Nora brought another log to the stove, pushing her hair back with the back of her wrist. It had come entirely loose overnight, falling in soft waves around her face. She didn't seem to notice. "The storm did its worst," she said, peering out, but the wind calmed. "We can shovel a path." "With what?" Caleb asked. Nora smiled faintly. "With determination, mostly." "I've got that," Caleb said earnestly. Elias chuckled. "You always do." They gathered what tools the schoolhouse had. A broken-handled shovel, a student slateboard sturdy enough to scrape snow, and a wide wooden bucket used for carrying kindling. It wasn't much, but it would do. Elias pushed against the door first. It barely budged. "Here," Nora said, wedging her shoulder beside his. Together they leaned into it, their combined strength forcing the door open, just enough for a flood of loose snow to spill inside like cold sand. Ruth squeaked and jumped back. Caleb rushed to help Elias push the snow aside with the bucket. Outside the world was quiet and white, so white it hurt the eyes. Drifts shaped by the storm curled like frozen waves. The schoolhouse roof wore a thick cap of snow, and icicles hung from the eaves like crystal teeth. Breath plumed in the air, vanishing as quickly as it came. "We'll start here," Elias said, stepping into the drift. Snow swallowed his boots to the knee. "Caleb, use the slate to clear a path along the wall. Ruth, stay inside where it's warm." Ruth's face scrunched. "But I want to help." "You can pass wood to Miss Haven," Elias offered. "She'll need someone brave to keep the fire strong." That satisfied her. She saluted, making Nora laugh. The work began slowly. Elias carved away a path, each shovel of snow heavy as wet sand. Caleb scraped along the bottom edges, revealing the wooden steps beneath in increments. Nora brought blankets to the doorway, letting warm air spill into the cold so Elias and Caleb could warm their hands briefly before returning to work. It took nearly an hour to clear enough snow to reach the road. By then, the morning light had grown, illuminating Alder Creek's white-blanketed silence. "I don't see anyone," Caleb murmured. "They're digging out too," Nora said. "Storm like this, it humbles a town." Elias leaned on his shovel, catching his breath. "We should get you home," Nora continued. "The children need rest where they're familiar." Elias nodded, though something in him tightened at the thought of leaving. The warmth of this unexpected shelter. Caleb took the sled rope. Ruth slipped her hand into Nora's mittened one. The walk through the snow was slow, but the storm had softened the world. Trees bowed under the weight of white, roofs glistened like sugar, and the air held that crisp, pure scent that only comes after everything has been washed clean. Washed harshly, but clean nonetheless. When they reached the Granger cabin, Elias stopped short. Snow had piled high against the front wall, pressing like a giant hand. The roof had held, but barely. Smoke did not rise from the chimney. Of course it didn't. There had been nothing. Burning when they left. The cabin stood small and sad beneath the winter's weight. But not broken. Not yet. Nora surveyed it with assessing eyes. "We'll need to clear the roof soon. But first, get the fire started." Elias nodded and pushed the door open. Cold rushed out like a gasp. The single room felt hollow, the air sharp enough to sting fingers. Ruth clung to Elias's coat. "Papa, it's colder than outside." "Yes," he said softly, "but not for long." Nora set down her basket. "I brought some food from the schoolhouse. And blankets." Elias turned sharply. "Nora, you've done too much." "No," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I've done what any neighbor should." He swallowed. "Thank you." The fire crackled to life slowly. Caleb helped arrange the logs with careful precision, making sure the flame breathed properly. Ruth sat wrapped in blankets near the hearth, watching the sparks rise. When the room warmed, even a little, Nora finally removed her coat. It was covered in frost, her cheeks stained pink from the cold, her hair feathered with melting snowflakes. "You shouldn't walk home in this," Elias said. "Road's too deep." "I wasn't planning to." She smiled faintly. "I'll need to wait until the drifts settle anyway." Caleb passed her a cup of warm water. "You can stay here," he said shyly. Nora touched the cup gratefully. "Thank you, Caleb." Elias settled onto the low bench beside the table. "I should check the barn," he murmured. Nora's expression softened. "Do you still go out there?" "Yes, even after the fire?" "Because of it," he said. "It reminds me what we lost. And what we still have." She nodded. "Then go. I'll stay with the children." He stepped out into the snow-covered path to the barn. The building stood charred and blackened, half collapsed but not yet surrendered to time. The smell of ash still lingered faintly beneath the new snow. The fire had taken much: tools, livestock, Martha's quilts, but Elias could still picture her here, her sleeves rolled, her hair braided, her laughter echoing in the rafters. "Still with me," he murmured into the cold. "Still guiding me." He wasn't sure if he meant Martha or something else entirely. Inside the cabin, Nora watched through the window. Caleb noticed her expression. "Papa goes to the barn a lot," he said. "I imagine he would," Nora replied quietly. Do you think he'll rebuild it?" Nora looked at him, a boy trying so hard to be a man, yet still needing someone to tell him the world would hold steady. "Yes," she said, "I do." Caleb nodded, confidence flickering in his eyes. Ruth crawled into Nora's lap, warming her cold fingers against Nora's shawl. "Miss Haven," she whispered, "will you come again? After today?" Nora wrapped her arms around the little girl, pulling her close. "If your father doesn't mind," she said. "And if you'd like me to." Ruth nodded vigorously. "We like you." Nora closed her eyes briefly, as though steadying herself against a swell of emotion. "I like you too," she whispered. When Elias returned, snow clinging to his coat, he paused at the threshold. Ruth in Nora's lap, Caleb listening attentively as Nora explained how frost forms on windows. The room warm, the atmosphere soft, a kind of belonging blooming where none had existed yesterday. He swallowed. "You all right?" Nora asked gently. He nodded. "Just taking it in." They shared a look, quiet, knowing, weighted with something neither dared name. Outside, the sun finally broke the clouds, spilling pale gold across the snow. Trees glittered. Ice cracked softly as warmth returned. Nora stood. "I should check if anyone else in town needs help. Once the road clears." "You can take the sled," Caleb offered. Nora smiled. "Thank you. But let's wait until the snow settles." Elias approached her slowly. "Nora, about yesterday. About everything. You don't have to thank me," she said. "I do," he insisted. "You guided us through the storm. You gave my children warmth when I couldn't. You gave me—" He stopped, unable to finish. She stepped closer. "You gave them everything you had. That's more than enough." He looked at her, really looked. Soft hair, tired eyes, strong hands. A woman carved by winter, yet still carrying spring inside her. "I'd like you to come for supper," he said finally. Not out of gratitude. Out of wanting. Her breath caught, the faintest tremble in it. "Tomorrow?" "Yes," she nodded, her eyes bright. "I'll come." A knock sounded at the door. It startled all of them. Elias opened it to find Reverend Hollister, cheeks flushed, breath fogging. "Glad you're safe," the preacher said. "We've a town to dig out. And, Elias, there's council news." Elias stiffened. "The marshal won't be collecting on winter debts this season," the Reverend said. "Storm changed things. Folks realized we need each other more than ledgers." Elias stared, disbelief flooding him. "You mean—" "No foreclosure," Hollister said firmly. "Your land's safe through spring." Caleb exhaled in visible relief. Ruth clapped her hands. Nora smiled softly, understanding the weight lifted from the room. The preacher stepped back. "Town's gathering at the square to clear snow. If you're able, join us. If not, rest." He left as quickly as he'd come. Elias stood rooted for a moment, emotion building like a slow tide. Relief, gratitude, a future he hadn't dared imagine. Nora approached him, eyes bright with quiet joy. "See?" she whispered. "The world hasn't abandoned you." He looked at her. "No," he said. "It hasn't." Outside, neighbors began calling to one another, voices carrying across the bright white field. The whole town slowly awakened, emerging into the aftermath of storm with shovels. Laughter, urgency, and hope. Elias grabbed his coat. "We should help." Caleb nodded. Ruth bounced with excitement. Nora stepped toward the door too, but Elias gently touched her arm. "You're part of this family now," he said quietly. "You know that?" Nora froze, breath catching. Then she smiled. The kind of smile that felt like the beginning of something neither had words for yet. "I'd like to be," she whispered. They walked out into the snow together, Elias, his children, and Nora, toward the town square where the community waited. Not as outcasts, not as charity, but as neighbors, as a family forming beneath winter's weight, as people rebuilding, together. And as the sun edged higher, melting frost into glittering streams, Elias Granger felt something he hadn't in years, hope rising like spring beneath snow.